This is the famous short novel written in 1902 by W. W. Jacobs, The Monkey's Paw. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of the White family's cozy home. Inside, the fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Mr. White and his son Herbert sat over a chessboard while Mrs. White knitted peacefully nearby. Mr. White said, "It's no use, Herbert." "You've got me this time." Herbert chuckled. "You need to plan ahead, Father. Think a few moves ahead, like I do." Their light-hearted banter was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mr. White stood and opened it to reveal a tall, burly man with a weathered face. It was Sergeant Major Morris, an old friend who had served in distant lands. After shedding his coat and settling by the fire, Morris shared stories of his travels. Morris said, "And then I came across the monkey's paw." Mrs. White asked, "What's so special about a monkey's paw?" Morris lowered his voice. "It's cursed. A fakir enchanted it to show that fate rules our lives. It grants 3 wishes, but at a terrible cost." He pulled a small, shriveled paw from his pocket. Its dry fingers twisted unnaturally. Herbert leaned forward. "It looks harmless enough. Are you sure it has power?" Morris's eyes darkened. "Power, yes, but not the kind you want. I've seen good men ruined by it. I've seen things that cannot be explained." Mrs. White shuddered. "What kind of things?" Morris shook his head. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." Herbert said skeptically, "Why don't you wish for something then?" Morris replied grimly, "I did, and I've seen others use it too. The wishes come true, yes, but not in the way you'd hope. That's why I tried to destroy it." Mrs. White said eagerly, "Well, why don't we have it?" Morris warned, "If you take it, don't blame me for what happens." Reluctantly, he handed the paw to Mr. White, who examined it with a mix of fascination and dread. Later that evening, as the family joked about the paw, Mr. White held it up. Mr. White said playfully, "Well, why not try it?" "I wish for £200 to clear the mortgage." The paw twisted in his hand, startling him. Herbert laughed. "See, nothing happened. Just a bunch of nonsense." They all laughed, but a chill hung in the air. That night, Mr. White sat by the fire, turning the paw over in his hands. Doubts began to creep in. What if Morris had been right? He set the paw down and went to bed, but dreams of riches and shadows haunted his sleep. The next day, as Mrs. White prepared tea, a stranger approached their home. He wore a somber expression and hesitated before speaking. The stranger said awkwardly, "I'm from Ma and Megan's. Your son? There was an accident at the factory. He didn't make it. But as compensation, they're offering £200. The words hung heavy in the room. Mrs. White screamed, clutching her chest, while Mr. White collapsed into a chair. Hours later, Mrs. White wandered through the house, clutching Herbert's jacket. "He was just here yesterday," she murmured, laughing, playing chess. Mr. White tried to console her, but his own guilt weighed him down. He stared at the paw, now lying motionless on the table. Had he caused this? Days passed in silence. Grief consumed the house, until one night Mrs. White sat upright in bed. Mrs. White said desperately, "The paw! Use the paw to bring Herbert back." Mr. White hesitated. "No, it's unnatural." Mrs. White pleaded, "He's our son. We can't leave him like this." Reluctantly, Mr. White retrieved the paw. His hand shook as he whispered, "I wish for my son to live again." The wind howled outside, and a heavy silence fell. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the house. Mrs. White exclaimed ecstatically, "It's him! It's Herbert!" She rushed to the door, fumbling with the locks. Mr. White panicked. Wait! What if it's not him? His mind raced with horror. What state would Herbert be in after being buried for days? As she pulled the final lock, Mr. White grabbed the paw and made his final wish. Mr. White said desperately, "I wish him gone." The knocking ceased. Mrs. White flung the door open to find nothing but the empty night. The monkey's paw fell from Mr. White's hand, its power spent. In the quiet house, the couple sat together, mourning their loss and the terrible price of tampering with fate. And so the wind carried away the last whispers of a lesson learned too late. Sometimes it's better to leave fate untouched